All right, so here we are at the Magic Online Championship. I'm just bringing up the match here so that we can take a look
Looks
at
like on
Lars
the left, we have
Dom.
defending champion, Lars Dom, and on the right, Timothy Divelbliss.
Yep, that's them. And it looks like the players are ready to go here.
So looking at the deck list here, it looks like Lars has decided to bring a deck that I played in the finals of the Vintage Super League to be able to take it down. And I believe Luis Scott Vargas has affectionately dubbed this deck Frobots.
Frobots.
What this deck is a Mishra's Workshop deck. You can see in Lars' opening hand that fifth card in there, that's Mishra's Workshop. What that card does is you tap it, you add 3 mana to your mana pool. Pretty good deal. Of course, that mana can only be used for artifacts. And yeah, this deck is just full of artifacts. It's a mono colorless deck. Everything in the deck can be cast with Mishra's Workshop. And the goal of the deck is to basically cast cards that will lock your opponent out of being able to cast spells. These are cards like Sphere of Resistance, a 2-mana artifact that makes all spells cost 1 color more. There's Thorn of Amethyst, which is a 2-mana artifact that makes all non-creature spells cost 1 mana more. And then you have, as you can see, the first card in the hand, a Lodestone Golem, which he can actually cast on turn 1 with Workshop and a Mox Jet. And that's a 5/3 creature that makes all non-artifact spells cost 1 more. And so what this deck does is it casts these spells that effectively make your opponent not be able to cast anything. And from that position, it's pretty easy to win the game.
And it looks like we're underway here. Lars Dom on the top side of your screen running out the turn 1 Lodestone Golem. Really one of the strongest openers for this deck.
Absolutely. If Timothy had a Force of Will and another blue card to be able to cast it, Lars' hand does nothing. The rest of his hand is all lands. As is, this thing is definitely threatening to just effectively win the game on the spot. Now, Timothy does have Ancestral Recall, which means he'll get to draw 3 cards next turn because he has 2 lands. He'll be able to cast it through the Lodestone Golem, but he's pretty far behind. He's going to be taking at least 10 damage to be able to set that up, and that's no small price. What Timothy's playing, as you can tell from the Young Pyromancer on the far left, that's typically going to signify that he's playing Delver, which we can see under his name that he is in fact playing Delver. And this is a blue-red version. He's actually splashing white for what appears to just be Containment Priest in the sideboard. There's a preordained drawn for the turn, it looks like. And what this deck does is it plays some early creatures, some early threats in Delver of Secrets, a Young Pyromancer. And, you cast a bunch of instants and sorceries to be able to create a bunch of tokens. And this deck has a lot of ways to cycle through its deck. It has the Ancestral Recall to draw 3 cards. You see the Dig Through Time there, which allows you to see a whole bunch of cards, lots of selection. There's Brainstorm. There's 4 copies of Preordain, the card you can see on the far right. There's Ponder. So lots of ways to see a lot of different cards. 1 Treasure Cruise, which is pretty common. Basically every blue deck knows that card is restricted.
Here we go, by the way. Ancestral Recall just hit the stack, and of course Resolve. That was in response to Wasteland taking out 1 of Timothy's lands. In the meantime, he's going to take a beatdown of 7 here, and now that he cracked those 2 fetches, this is a 2-turn clock here. He's looking to be dead next turn if he can't do something about this Lodestone Golem.
He really need to find a Lightning Bolt. As is, he's not actually going to be able to cast anything. He is just dead.
Yeah, he can resolve a Preordain and then have nothing left. Yeah.
Right, which can actually draw him into Black Lotus, which will allow him to cast Young Pyromancer. Black Lotus not affected by Lodestone Golem as it's an artifact. But all that is going to be basically a 1-turn roadblock. He didn't actually find it. So.
Wow, he's got all the Preordains in the world, all 4 in his hand here, but that's not going to do it. And I think we're going to see a pretty quick game 1 here. Sometimes this happens in Vintage. It doesn't happen as often as most people think. I think that there's a misconception about this format that, it's one of those things where just like somebody does something crazy and the other person doesn't get to interact. It's not generally the case, though. The turn 1 Lodestone Golem that goes unanswered does tend to close the door pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. As we saw, Lars did not actually draw a spell at any point in the game. On the last turn, we actually saw him draw what looks like a blue spell in Phyrexian Metamorph. That thing actually costs Phyrexian mana and is an artifact that will just create a copy of Lodestone Golem or another artifact when it enters the battlefield. So he can actually cast that off of his Mishra's Workshop, but did not need to do so as the Lodestone Golem alone was enough to get it done. Being on the play with the Workshop deck is a huge advantage. If your opponent doesn't have Force of Will and you're able to get down one of those effects that basically cause your opponent to not be able to cast spells, well, then they can't cast spells.
That's right. You can take a look at Lars Dom, our defending champion. He's from Denmark. He's one of 2 players from Denmark here, Martin Dang being the other. They're actually good friends. They tested together quite a bit for this tournament, including for the vintage portion, ultimately settling on the Frobots deck that you played. And interestingly, a lot of their testing, I talked to them, was based on the Vintage Super League. They looked to the VSL as their pseudo metagame on which to make decisions because they figured that's what everybody else would do too. And they thought that this was the best deck for them. I talked to you about this yesterday, Ifro. This is a deck that, well, it tends to care a little bit more about what it's doing rather than what your opponent's doing. I mean, there's some level of interaction there, but not as much as some of the decks we see here.
No, absolutely. And being on the play is a huge advantage for a deck like this. We're able to cast these cards that lock your opponent out before they're able to get on the board. The Delver deck, once it's on the play, can do a lot of great things. I guess we're looking at the Frobots deck right now, but you notice that there's a lot of cards that help lock your opponent out of the game. If they're on the play, well, they get the opportunity to preordain Ancestral, do everything they need to do before you can get a Sphere effect down, and occasionally you're able to get like a Delver of Secrets or even a Young Pyromancer out on turn 1 before any of these effects come down, and now the pressure you're putting on your opponent might be too much. After sideboard, what Timothy has available, which a lot of vintage decks do, which is why Workshops doesn't necessarily crush things as much as it might, is that people have a lot of sideboard options. There's a lot of great cards to bring in, and Timothy's deck is no exception. He gets to bring in a basic mountain. He gets 4 copies of Ingot Chewer, which is a 5-mana, 3/3 creature that when it comes into play, you get to destroy an artifact, and that has Evoke 1, which means that you sacrifice it when you cast it, but you get to kill an artifact, you get to get around Chalice of the Void, and now you can cast Ingot Chewer. What he also has is 2 copies of Pulverize. We can see one of them in the hand. And what that does, you can sacrifice 2 mountains and destroy all artifacts.
Wow.
Yeah, that one's not messing around.
And the cost is to sacrifice just the 2 mountains, meaning that you could tap them to pay for any additional costs that you're on the hook to pay thanks to whatever Lars is up to. In the meantime, Lars has his opener of Mox Arcbound Ravager here, and he's not done yet. It looks like he's going to be able to Wasteland here if he wants to as well.
The Wasteland here is super powerful.
Wow. That's nasty.
Now, this Ravager is not the fastest clock in the world against this opener, so Timothy is going to have some time to set up. Boarding in the basic mountain is big against a deck that is trying to deny you mana, even though it's not just through Wastelands, through Sphere effects as well. So you're able to have a red source that can only be dealt with Strip Mine, which is a restricted card. So
there's only one of.
There's a max of one of. All the Workshop decks are certainly going to play it. It's strictly better than Wasteland, but not every deck is actually going to play that card.
Right. But Lars's deck will certainly have it, and it looks like he's lining up another Arcbound Ravager here. His other play, he doesn't have any other plays currently, as Triskelion and Lodestone Golem both cost more mana than he currently has, but he can look next turn to play a Lodestone Golem and put himself pretty significantly ahead of Timothy.
He would be able to put himself pretty far ahead, but Timothy's hand is pretty well set up right now. The Force of Will with another blue card means that he's not under any immediate threat of anything actually getting out of hand.
Does that help?
Ancestral Recall. That's a nice one, yeah.
Yeah, because one thing that we see here that you normally see from the Workshops deck that Lars is playing is there's usually some type of effect that makes your spells cost more, and he just doesn't have any of those this game so far. So right now, Timothy, while he did get Wastelanded, and that did set him back, he has enough lands to be able to recover, and he's got clean slate here. He can do whatever he wants as long as he can deploy these cards fast enough.
Yeah, he's got a few great options here. He can just play the Young Pyromancer right now, and he could just Pulverize, make a token. It'll knock him out to no lands, but any land he draws will be able to cast Ancestral Recall and put a token out there, and this will actually kill 2 of the 3 mana sources Lars has, and it's unlikely he has a land that produces multiple mana in his hand since Mishra's Factory is the land he actually chose to play.
Wow, it looks like he's going for that too, Ifro. Sick. He's going to Pulverize, and let's see what he's targeting here. Assuming both Moxen, right?
No, it destroys all artifacts.
Oh, it
It's
destroys
Shatterstorm.
all artifacts.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness.
No, if this destroyed 2 artifacts, this would not be the play.
Right.
No questions asked about it. But what it does do is it destroys all the artifacts. And now that he actually, I don't think is planning on casting Ancestral Recall in this game. At least he doesn't care if he casts Ancestral Recall because he has 2 Force of Wills and 2 blue cards. And if he casts either one of them, he's going to get another 1/1 token. So the threat that it's putting out there is a big one. So he's sacking artifacts to the Ravager. I hope he doesn't activate the factory because the Pulverize will just kill it.
Yeah,
Okay.
that does become an artifact creature. But so huge play there for Timothy as he looks to be in great shape now. He does have to deal with this Mishra's Factory, but it looks like he's got the tools to go later in the game here. Now, this is interesting. A Chalice on 1. Is that going to have to get countered here? How important is that
This is
Ancestral?
usually a huge play against the Delver decks. It's not as important after sideboarding because you do have access to 4 Ingot Chewers and 2 Pulverizes, which get around it. I would generally choose to not counter that here because of how far ahead he is on board. The problem is that the 2 factories are actually representing pretty decent blockers for this army. So
That's right.
His game plan is, I guess, to try to pull further ahead with the Ancestral Recall when he gets that opportunity.
It did feel like he was trying to protect his Ancestral Recall. Now, he is going to need to find a land. You mentioned it. Really, any land in his deck now will give him access to Recall, and also there's a Ponder. And it looks like Timothy is really concerned about protecting that Ancestral Recall. He's going to go ahead and Force of Will here, leaving himself with just the Ancestral in hand now.
Right, and the fact that he gets a token out of it is a pretty big deal. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty tough to use Force of Wills on a card that's not actually currently impacting the board. That's a tough decision. The fact that your opponent has the factories out there that can actually block your army is pretty rough. Although that Sudden Shock, should he be able to cast it, would be pretty fantastic.
Now, he doesn't have any attacks here.
Nope.
Lars has gone on the defensive, just threatening the Mishra's Factory. And here's Black Lotus off the top for Lars Dom. Is that going to give him access to the Lodestone Golem here?
It is.
Oh, baby.
So Lodestone Golem is going to potentially shut Ancestral Recall out for the entire game just because this Delver deck plays generally 14 lands, and this one is no exception. Bringing in the basic mountain means he's up to 15 lands, but he's already down, I think, 4 lands, maybe 5. I think he might have used 2 fetch lands already. The Volcanic got wasted, and he sacked the Volcanic and the mountain. So we're not looking at too many lands left in the deck, period.
Yeah, so there's a Volcanic, a Flooded Strand, another Volcanic, and a mountain in his yard currently.
Yeah, so we're looking at 10 more lands left in the deck. So the odds of drawing a land on any given turn are barely over 20% at this point. And so he's going to need multiple lands before he can even cast Ancestral Recall.
Now, how does the Lodestone Golem match up against the Young Pyromancer here? Where does this go if we go further into the game?
Well, what the Lodestone Golem does is it shuts down basically the avenue of attack. It can't attack itself because it will just trade with a few tokens. Not a great spot. But it also basically is going to do a great job of locking Timothy out of creating more tokens. As you noticed, if he draws a single land, casts Ancestral Recall, his odds of hitting another land off that are pretty decent, or at least to find another one pretty soon are not too bad. And if he's able to find 2 lands, well, now he can attack with everything. If a Mishra's Factory gets activated, he can Sudden Shock it before it can tap and use its ability to become bigger because of the split second.
Sure.
And he gets a token each time. This is shutting him out from getting tokens, and basically is just locking him down. At this point, Lars is incredibly far ahead in the game.
Wow, crazy. It felt like Timothy was so far ahead. He had basically Shatterstormed away everything with that. Was Pulverize? And
it is Pulverize.
Yeah, and he was ahead on board with the Young Pyromancers, but those Mishra's Factories really held back the attacks until he could find that Black Lotus, and now all of a sudden, Lars is pulling further and further ahead. He just played a Thorn of Amethyst.
It's possible he was a bit too hasty with his Pulverize. He was able to play the Young Pyromancer. He could have then set up to cast Ancestral next turn. There weren't too many threats that could really impact him in any way because he had Force of Will, so nothing could land that he didn't want to land, and he wasn't facing down too much damage. You see he's at 16 life. He was facing down 2 Ravagers that reach 1/1s. There's not a lot that Lars could do, if anything at all, that would really threaten him in any way. And so I think the biggest fear at that point is going to be that your opponent's going to play like an Ancient Tomb or a Mishra's Workshop and play a Sword of Fire and Ice and kill your Young Pyromancer. But with Force of Will, that's not really a huge threat. And so he would be able to pull pretty far ahead and set himself up in a position where he could take the game down more consistently.
Look at Lars's hand.
Of course, he hasn't found a land in
Double
7 or 8 turns.
Triskelion. This is old school Magic, no doubt about it. And the players really haven't been able to mount an offensive in either direction here. Here's a second Lodestone Golem for Lars, but he can't cast it yet, and he's just going to have to sit here. Flooded Strand, though, for Timothy means he is inching closer. Now he's taking a look at his draw step here, which is an Ingot Chewer, which is what you mentioned earlier.
Interestingly, Timothy has a copy of Mental Misstep in his hand. And what this tells me is that Timothy has not played Vintage before. Because this is the single worst card in your deck against a Workshop deck. There is one target in the entire deck, just Soul Ring.
It's literal one target.
There's literal one target.
And since we're post-board, you would have expected that to come out.
That is the first card to come out 100% of the time, yes.
Okay.
Let's see. He also has 2 copies of Flusterstorm, which counters instants or sorceries. So the Flusterstorms and the Mental Missteps are the easy cuts, where we don't even consider playing those after sideboard. They have effectively no impact on the game whatsoever. So that could have just been either he missed it while sideboarding and accidentally left one in, or has not actually played against Workshops before.
I think it's important to remember that, for these players, Vintage is often a new experience, and they're being asked to play it at a pretty high level. I think that, you and I both agreed yesterday that this format in Vintage, this is the one where the most edge can be gained.
Absolutely.
This is the one where the skill gap is going to be the highest, the experience gap, and even the deck technology gap is going to be there. So this is going to play out in an interesting way. If you're used to watching VSL, those are all hardcore Vintage players like yourself, the Rich Shays of the world, Luis. But here we have people that are probably more focused on more current level formats and have to adapt on the fly. It's going to be fun to watch.
As that second Lodestone Golem came down, you could see Timothy visibly lean back in his chair and sigh. He knows that this game is basically all but over.
Yeah.
There's almost no chance that Timothy is going to cast a relevant spell at any point in this game. He could sack the Flooded Strand to get an island to allow him to cast, let's say, a Mox Sapphire, Mox Ruby, or Black Lotus. But every spell that he casts that is a non-artifact, non-creature is going to cost 3 additional, which means 4 minimum. He can actually sack Flooded Strand to get island, cast a Black Lotus off the island, and sack Black Lotus, paying 2 colorless extra to cast Ingot Chewer, since that gets around Thorn of Amethyst. But all that does is kill a single artifact. The Ingot Chewer itself will die. The Black Lotus will go away, and things just get worse from there.
And speaking of getting worse, his Tangle Wire is going to work here on Timothy's board, tapping down 4 of his 5 available permanents, and you can see the abusive nature of that Tangle Wire. As Lars finds a Mishra's Workshop off the top, which is going to allow him to cast a Triskelion here.
And that may draw the concession.
That should do it. Yeah, so Triskelion, of course, you can remove counters from it to do 1 damage, and this is kind of what it's for, right? It's here to mow down Young Pyromancer like it just did right there, and even some tokens. This is going to clear the way for a 10-point attack here for Lars. And with that Tangle Wire on the battlefield, still with 3 counters on it, this one is just about in the books.
Not that he needs many of the things currently in play, but each one definitely is another nail.
There's a Treasure Cruise just for the rub-ins for Timothy. And he is going to pass the turn back and go to discard here. But it does look like our defending champion with the Frobots deck is going to take down the first match. You can see he's got a smile on his face now. And why not? He's got a really great board state. He's got the win here. And he's got his tournament off to a good start. So Lars Stam wins the match over Timothy Devilbus, 2-0. And you can see a smile there from Timothy. You mentioned it, and in many cases, he's probably saying something like, well, there goes my 3rd match of Vintage. These ones can be tough.
Yeah, that is tough for sure. I mean, the Delver deck on the play after sideboarding is pretty well advantaged in this matchup. And even the hand that he had felt very advantaged in the game that we were watching. He had the Pulverize, he had the Force of Will with the blue card and the Young Pyromancer in play. That's a tough spot to kind of get buried from, and it really didn't take very long for that to happen. It was just a couple Mishra's factors that were able to get the job done and shut him out of that game.
So it goes. All right. Well, we're going to send it right now to something that we do at these Magic Online specific events. We've got the Red Zone. Brian David Marshall's over there. Brian, what do you got for us?
Well, I have Hall of Famer Ole Rade playing against Lucas Dusak. And Rade's playing one of the decks. I know Randy was pretty excited to see it. Kind of a Grixis Cabal Therapy deck that, we're going to watch in action right here. Here we go. Ole Rade is up on top. Of course, the Pro Tour Hall of Famer. And Dusak leads off with a Preordain. And that's immediately taken out with a Mental Misstep. And then we see Preordain from Ole. Gitaxian Probe. His deck seems to be getting a lot of information here. He's just drawing a ton of cards. Just Ponder now. All the cheap blue card draw. Gitaxian Probe. And then now Cabal Therapy. And he names Monastery Mentor. He's looked at Dusak's hand enough that he knows exactly what he's holding. He gets a Monastery Mentor. And then the next turn, he Snapcaster Mages back the Cabal Therapy. And what does he name? He names Force of Will. He gets a Force of Will. And then down comes the Young Pyromancer. Gitaxian Probe makes a token. And his deck is going to work. Gets in for 3. Plays a Cabal Therapy. But it gets misdirected by Lucas. And, it's fine. He names Abandon Hope. Ole Rade just sort of maybe trolling his opponent a little bit here.
He named Abandon Hope.
He named Abandon Hope on himself. So he casts Time Walk now, gets another token, gets another turn. Bolts Dusak, gets another token. Untaps. Attacks with everybody. Doesn't know how to use the attack with all button there. And it's really just kind of all over but the conceding at this point.
Yeah, very tough for Vintage. That's
the
to come
game is
back
over
from
there.
tokens.
So that's game 1. I haven't taken a look at game 2 yet, but I'm going to queue it up. Let's send it back to the booth while I get that ready.
All right, thanks, BDM. So we'll jump back over there when he's ready to go. You just said that, Efro. Vintage decks have a hard time coming back from tokens, which sounds funny, I think, to some people because they're just dumb little 1/1s. Like, what deck can't deal with those? But Vintage isn't really set up for that kind of a fight.
Yeah, it's tough to deal with in a lot of formats in general. You try to go bigger with bigger creatures very often, something like Standard, or you might have something like a Polukranos that can kind of mow down a few things, or you create a bunch of tokens of your own. But as we see in Standard, Elspeth Sun's Champion, it floods the board out and does a lot of great things. What the Vintage decks do, and why Young Pyromancer is considered, I believe, to be the best creature, is you put a few tokens out there, and you're able to keep casting these instants that are protecting them. And so you're just getting more tokens. It's spiraling out of control, and you can't really afford to play things that deal with a bunch of creatures. You can't play sweepers in Vintage because there's a lot of decks that don't have a single creature. It's common in Vintage to not have a single creature. And even a deck like Lars Dam's Frobot deck, if you want to be able to cast like a Supreme Verdict to kill a bunch of creatures, well, it might cost you 8 mana. Like Vintage decks often play 14, 16 lands. It's not a lot. And so, it's going to be tough to afford a 4-mana spell through all these sphere effects.
All right, looks like we're ready to head back over to
Interview.
To the interview. All right, let's head back to the interview there where we've got Kenji Egashira with Lars Dom.
Kenji Egashira here with defending Magic Online champion Lars Dom. Lars, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
So we just saw you win round 1, which happens to be Vintage. Now, I know a lot of people aren't necessarily accustomed to Vintage. How prepared were you for this?
Not that prepared, to be honest, but I tested a decent amount with the deck, and it seemed very good against almost everything except Dredge.
Yeah, you seem to have put on a colorless clinic.
Yeah.
So what kind of things did you do to practice for Vintage then?
I basically only played with Martin. He's also in this tournament, and yeah, we played maybe 20 matches against each other, and we quickly discovered there's so many decks that we couldn't test at all. So we quickly focused on like a few of them, and the ones we expected to be the most popular, which was like the Delver, Pyromancer, Mentor, blue decks, and then the shop decks. So that was what we sort of tried to build the deck to be good against.
Nice. So your deck looks pretty similar to something I've seen on Vintage Super League. Is it?
Yes.
Did you watch a lot of that and practice by watching that?
Yeah, I watched a decent amount of it. I didn't watch all of it, but I yeah, I looked at the results, and it seemed the decks that always did well was the shop deck and the mentor decks. And all the other decks were sort of shaky in the way they performed.
Yeah, it seems so, but I don't know, after those first 2 games, like even in that second game, you were a little bit behind, it seemed, but then you really came back with those double lodestone golems.
Yeah, the problem was after he polarizes, he never drew more lands, and that happens in a deck that doesn't play that many mana sources. So you don't get to recover after sacrificing 2 lands. I also wastelanded 1. And obviously fetch lands are not optimal when you're trying to find more lands, because the thinning is real.
Yeah, well, it looks like you're doing really well so far. What kind of matchups do you particularly don't want to face?
Dredge. I think Dredge is a terrible matchup, and I also think Oath is probably a bad matchup, but I don't know enough about that.
Well, do you think if you do play any more, or I guess, of course, you're going to play 2 more rounds of Vintage, but is there, any killer hand what's the perfect ideal 7 for you?
Mishra's Workshop, Mox, a Lotus, a Lodestone Golem, and a Sphere of some kind. So you just lock the game on turn 1.
Okay. Well, thanks for answering some of my questions today, Lars. We'll send it back to the booth.
And thank you for that, Kenji. So welcome back to the booth here. We're going to jump over to BDM in just a minute. Once he's ready to go, he's got another replay lined up for us. But good stuff there. And the first round of Vintage, almost in the books here. Is it what you expected?
A little bit. I was impressed with the way that Lars played the Robots deck. I thought he did it proud. Something that I think that maybe people who aren't as familiar with Vintage might have been watching and see him kind of built up cards in his deck, in his hand. He had a multiple Sphere of Resistances in his hand that he didn't cast, and thinking that people who haven't seen the format before are like, why are you not casting this? It'll just make it harder for your opponent to cast spells. And the thing is, once you have a couple of those effects in play, when your opponent has 0 or 1 lands, that effect is symmetrical. And so it was very smart to not play these spheres, to be able to cast the Triskelion once he was able to get up to 6 mana. If he had played the spheres, he would not have been able to. And so there's no reason to put those cards into play when your opponent already can't cast anything and is several lands away from doing so. So I like the way that he sequenced his plays. He looked like he was pretty far behind and actually had a convincing victory. So good showing there for our defending champion.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's send it back to the red zone. BDM, what do you got?
Okay, well, I have the second game here between Ole Rade and Lukas Dusek, and Efro said, not really room for sweepers in this format, but Ole Rade found a little something in his sideboard to go up against the Monastery Mentors in the deck from Dusek. So Ole Rade has a Gitaxian Probe on turn 1, plays his Flooded Strand, Underground Sea, Mox Ruby, and then Snapcaster Mage. Snapcaster Mage gets Pyroblasted, and then a Mental Misstep from Rade resolves Snapcaster Mage, and then, of course, another Gitaxian Probe. Rade's turn 1, he's down to 13 here. Not a big deal. And then he's playing against Dusek, who's playing Monastery Mentors. And we're going to see him resolve Dread of Night. Dread of Night is a sweet one. So white creatures get -1/-1. It's not going to kill the Monastery Mentor you throw, but it does take care of all their tokens. What do you think of this card out of the sideboard?
Yeah, this is a card that I've played in my sideboard a couple times. There's a couple of good options in a deck like Ole's. A Dread of Night, of course, being only 1 mana is fantastic, and there's Sulfur Elemental actually, which actually sees some vintage play thanks to its split second ability, being able to come down, take out a bunch of monks, and leave a 3/2 behind. That is a little more expensive at 3 mana. Dread of Night, of course, only costing 1, but yeah, they're both excellent cards against Monastery Mentor.
So not quite Wraths, but they sort of. They kind of function as keeping the board under control.
Yeah, I mean, we see other cards like Electrickery and Volcanic Fallout from time to time, so definitely some room for some cheap ways to knock out a few creatures. But
so, Dusek, by the way, speaking of cheap ways, he gets to Swords to Plowshares, Snapcaster Mage, Cabal Therapy from Rade, Gush in response from Dusek, Brainstorm from Rade, Cabal Therapy resolves. It names Force of Will. Doesn't look like it hit. And now a Gush from Rade gets Pyroblasted.
This is a good old vintage fight here.
Yeah, this is sweet. Both players are just down to their moxes. This looks like a What are we getting here? Oh, I see some cards being delved. There was a Treasure Cruise, Marshall. I know you love that.
Oh, I love that card. They only let you play one, even in Vintage, but when you get to resolve it, it's pretty nice.
Yeah, the old restricted in Vintage, you can play 4 of them in Standard card.
Oh, now, well, you know what? He's got to dig through time. So these guys are going back and forth, but a Force of Will from Rade is going to counter that.
This is a sweet one.
And here comes Demonic Tutor. What are you getting, Eric? You're tutoring here.
That really depends on your hand. You can easily get something like
How
an
about
Ancestral Recall. Yeah, exactly the card I was going to say.
Isn't
if he
it
has
always Ancestral Recall?
well, if you have a huge graveyard and you haven't already cast your Treasure Cruise, often it can be correct if you think your opponent might have Mental Misstep. Or there are times where Treasure Cruise is just a better card to have in your hand than Ancestral Recall, but they're both extremely powerful.
So here you see a Monastery Mentor. So it's going to be a 1/1. It still has prowess, but every time it makes a token, that token's going to die to the Dread of Night.
Right. There's no opportunity to respond to prowess and survive the Dread of Night. It'll just instantly.
And young Pyromancer is going to outclass it pretty quickly here. Ponder makes a token.
This is kind of a beating here, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Ole's just way ahead.
Ole knows Vintage. So when Ole won the Invitational back in 1997 and got to become the Sylvan Safekeeper as a result of that, he had to beat Mike Long playing Vintage to win the Invitational.
And the format has not changed in 18 years.
Well, he fell in love with the format then and has continued to play it ever since. So,
Absolutely, yeah.
This is something he plays a lot. He plays a lot online. And this is just double Pyromancer.
Yeah.
You know, look, that is a Flusterstorm. That's quite a stack.
I really hope we get to see a Flusterstorm get Flusterstormed in this tournament, as it is one of the most challenging things to make sure you can line up all of your Storm copies with all of theirs.
And there's not a lot of dexterity in Magic. It's kind of been weeded out, but we've got one instance.
Here's a Sudden Shock.
If you haven't played Vintage before, that is a real challenge.
Yeah.
So Sudden Shock takes down one Pyromancer without it getting an opportunity to leave anything in its wake. But there's the Time Walk.
So Ole's resolved Treasure Cruise, Ancestral Recall, and Time Walk this game?
Yes.
Okay, just
No
double
big deal.
checking.
He's trying to decide his attackers.
Yeah, Prowess had already triggered, so no attacks.
Oh, but Dak Faden, who is
One of the top 3 thieves in the multiverse.
Yeah. So I'm going to take your mocks, says Ole Rade, and now without a prowess trigger on the stack, he sends 4 tokens into the 1/1 Monastery Mentor and drops Jusek to 12. And then Gush. It's so frustrating. You just like get all these Monastery Mentor triggers. You can imagine this game without the Dread of Night here.
Yeah, it would have ended many, many turns ago.
So Mental Misstep from Ole Rade there on a preordain. Just chumps. And then everyone's coming in. And Dusek is down to 6. There's a lightning bolt. It gets misstepped. But a token for Ole. Activate Stack Faden. And sends in most of the team. Leaves the Pyromancer behind. Here's a Cabal Therapy. Choosing card is Abandon Hope. Just wanted the token.
It's so brutal.
So a little bit of a spells there. But that is going to be the game. So Ole Rade, the one of the 3 Pro Tour champions in this field and the only Hall of Famer to play in the Magic Online Championship, wins his match 2-0 over Lucas Dusek. So sending it back to the booth.
Hey guys, welcome back to the booth here at the Magic Online Championship. That's Eric Froelich. I'm Marshall Sutcliffe, and we are 1 round to the good here. We're done with the first round of Vintage, and that was kind of just a savage beating, right? It's
Oh, yeah.
hard to tell. This is why I love having you in the booth for this type of stuff, and you guys in the booth at the VSL as well, is that I think Vintage is one of the formats where it's least clear